Okay, well, hi everyone, and thank you all for joining us this evening. My name is Amy, and I'm the museum coordinator at the North Atlantic Regional Museum. We are happy to have the opportunity to bring to you a digital speaker series in 2021. And while this event has no ticket cost, we do encourage you to make a donation to the North Atlantic Historical Society. The Historical Society is a not-for-profit organization dedicated to the collection, preservation, and presentation of local history. And your donations help to ensure that we can continue to offer these fantastic events. And the link for our donation page will be put in the chat box. You are welcome to leave your cameras on, but we now ask that you mute your microphones to limit any background noise. This presentation will be recorded and the video will be used for promotional and educational purposes by the Historical Society and will be posted on our official YouTube page. There will be opportunities for questions at the end of the presentation. The chat will be monitored and you can post any questions that you may have there, and I will open up the floor to questions at the end if you're interested in asking your questions to our speaker directly. Without further ado, I am very happy to introduce to you our speaker, Dr. Glenn Norclef. Dr. Norclef is an active Professor Emeritus researching global production networks, geographical impacts of technological change, and regional change in global peripheries. He believes that the bicycle is arguably the best artifact to capture the geography of the modern age as the first vehicle to offer people rapid movement, a utilitarian vehicle for daily transportation of people and goods, and an environmentally green machine in a postmodern world. We are very happy that Glenn has taken the time to prepare this presentation for us as he presents The 7 Ages of the Bicycle, a tour of the Huron Bicycle Museum. Thank you, Glenn.
Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us and welcome to the 19th century. We are going to stay mostly in the 19th century, but we will sneak into the early years of the 20th century at the end of the talk. Let's begin then at the beginning and see what these 7 ages are all about. If those of you who are historians may wonder about this sort of lineup of progress, so I want to assure you that the intention is not to present you what is called a Whig history, that the world gets better and better, and we are led there by brilliant men who have great inventions. The nature of technology, and we'll see this as we look at the bicycle, is bumbling and mixing and learning and making mistakes, going backwards and going all over it again, discarding crazy ideas that didn't work, improving the better ones, and working with the people who use the machines, getting feedback from them on how to make them better. So let's go through this 7-point sequence just to get it in our heads before we start. The bicycle in its earliest form was what we call a running machine or a draisine. And why it's called a draisine, you'll see in a minute. The next phase is the bone shaker or velocipede. The bone shaker will give you some idea of what it was like to ride. Then after that, in the third phase, the high wheeler appeared. You might call it a penny farthing. The correct name is an ordinary bicycle. That is actually the correct name. The fourth stage we'll look at is the high wheel safety, because the high wheeler was quite dangerous, and there were various attempts to make them safer so the riders didn't brain themselves. After that came the hard tire safety. Hard tire because this is pre-pneumatic tires. The next phase was pneumatic, but they didn't use a free wheel. They had a fixed wheel, which meant that you pedaled and never stopped pedaling, or at least the pedals never stopped going round. And the last phase we're looking at is the free wheel pneumatic, where you could stop pedaling and the free wheel allowed the bike to carry on, and you had pneumatic tires. So those are the 7 stages. And in my museum, the bicycles are laid out accordingly as you go around the museum. Well, let's go to the beginning, the first stage. Carl Derice's striding machine. That's the term I use. The German word is Laufmaschine. It was invented 204 years ago by, well, at that time he was called Baron Karl von Derice. But towards the end of his life, he renounced his title, hence he just became plain Carl Derice. The machine, you can see here, is seated. The guy here in the uniform is a messenger to the Duke of Mannheim, and he's on a draisine. So we'll look at one in a moment. He invented it in Mannheim, which is right beside the River Rhine, though he was born further north at Karlsruhe, which is about 50 kilometers north of Mannheim. No, sorry, south. Okay, let's look at the machine. And that is what it looks like, nicely painted. These and the next one I'm going to show you are reproductions, because there are only a handful of these have survived. They're all in high-level museums. You're not allowed to even breathe on them, never mind ride them. And as you'll see in a minute, my buddies and I like riding these things. And from riding them, you learn a lot, which the people who dust them off and never ride them don't learn. What can I tell you about this machine? Well, it's basically a carriage. And it was made by a carriage maker, for von Derice. Notice the steering here. You see there's two semicircles. That is the steering arrangement, exactly the same as you'll find on a carriage. Two semicircles, we call them a demi-lune, that ride over each other and allow you to steer. The steering pivot's right here at the front. It's a funny place to do. And then here you've got this long beam that you hold. And notice, you'll see it in the next picture a bit better, there's an armrest here. That is, in fact, has the same effect as tri-bars on a modern triathlon bicycle. The very first bicycle worked out that you needed to rest your arms, otherwise after a mile or two, your back was in excruciating pain. So there's the armrest, the tri-bar, if you like. Where is it gone? My arrow here. There. And notice here, these look like screws. They're adjusters. The seat can go up and down on these three. There's one at the back you can't see very well. And that was important because if you were going to run on this running machine or walk or stride, your feet had to reach the ground. But on the other hand, you didn't want them to hit too much ground or you'd soon wear your knees out. So you wanted to just, as you put your toes down, get a good grip and kick the bike forward. And they go pretty well. They go at about 8 kilometers an hour. So that's not bad. It's faster than a walking pace because you're rolling along. Let's look at this side on. There's the bike side on. You can see a little bit here, the steering arrangement. There's the steering bar and the armrest. There's the adjusters for height. You see it's lower in this one. And then back here is where you put your luggage. And there's a piece going acrossways, so you can put a roll up, whatever you want in this luggage area. Well, 2017 was an important year if you like old bikes, because it was the 200th anniversary of the invention of the very first bicycle. And to celebrate the occasion, a group of 13 of us rode from Nancy in France on these bikes, 264 kilometers to Karlsruhe, which was the birthplace of Carl Derice. We'll come back to that in a moment because I see here that this is an improvement, supposedly an improvement by the Brits on the German Dreisine. This was called the hobby horse or the pedestrian accelerator. It was invented by Dennis Johnson, whose name for some reason has gone up to the top. Anyhow, that was I'm going to go back to that just to show you some of the changes. Two wheels as before, but Johnson has turned the steering into direct steering. You see the steering straight down here instead of around the corner. Still an armrest, a seat that goes up and down, because again, you've got to be able to hit the ground with your feet at exactly the right place. Well, this machine and the Draisine, they were very expensive. They were mostly bought by the sons of the nobility, very rich people. And to this day, the ones that survive are mostly in the private collections of leading people, like the Duke of Northumberland in England has got in his castle, Alnwick Castle, two of these hobby horses, which he bought for his sons. These were, if you like, the Mustangs, or whatever you want to call them, of the age. This is why the young bloods showed off on these things. When they got married, they moved on to other things. Well, that's all very well and good, excepting that there were blacksmiths and carpenters and wheelwrights who knew how to make, and in fact made these machines for the nobility and the wealthy, but they had sons who wanted to have one too. And so what happened was they started making their own. And some of these have survived, and this is my idea of exactly what that was about. I got a Mennonite wheelwright who lives near me. I live in Kincardine on Lake Huron. He made me two wooden wheels of the right type. He bent an ash beam in a steam box, so it's a bent. A local carver carved a nice horse's head. My granddaughter put a tail on the machine. And there we have, for much less cost, a classical, artisanal, or craftsman hobby horse. Now, what was I going to say? Let me show you the hobby horse. And the horse, beautiful head. These were decorated in all sorts of different ways, mostly as animals. So I've seen flamingo hobby horses, crocodile hobby horses, snakes, all sorts of dogs, animals, you name it. Hobby horses have been decorated and carved for everything. So let's look closely at a wheel, because I told you I did a long ride, a bunch of us did, 13 of us. This is a wheel, wooden wheel, hickory spokes, I think an ash rim, could be hickory or ash, but it has, and they all had a steel tire. This thing here is a steel tire. And when you were riding them 200 years ago on a dirt road, that was fine, because the dirt road it absorbed a lot of the shocks. When we ride them today on a macadam's, on a tarred, hard road, a hard surface or concrete surface, they shake you to pieces, they shake the bike to pieces. It does a lot of damage. And what we decided to do, and it worked, is we glued on this piece of rubber, hard, compact rubber, with super glue, and it gave us a ride like they would have had in 1819 and 1817, and it saved us and our machines. Well, there we are, a group of us, 13 of us, in front of the gates in Place Stanislav in Nancy in 2017. And you can see here that magnificent gates. If any of you have been there, you'll know what a wonderful square this is, fantastic. You can see us all on our machines ready for the start. And one I'll point out, you see how this guy's knees are bent? He ended up having to raise his seat because he was so uncomfortable trying to swing his leg forward when he was too low. This seat is exactly the right height. So we rode for 5 days on these machines, and it was a lot of fun. We had every night had a very nice French dinner and enjoyed it. This is a bit of the outfit. This is me on my hobby horse. This is the early stage of stovepipe hats. The riding outfit was actually what people rode horses in. As you see, there's a bit of a tail. The tail would be longer for a horse rider, a jockey, but it would catch up in the rear wheel so it's cut off a little bit at this height here. So that's the kind of outfit that people rode these in. Well, that's the first stage. 1817, 1818, 1819. And then nothing happened in terms of technical development for nearly 50 years. And that's a curiosity. It's a curiosity because it was logical enough to put cranks and pedals on one of those machines. There were lots of other machines in factories. There were spinning wheels, which have a crank driving a wheel around. So why didn't they do it on a bicycle? And at first, for the last 100 years, people thought, well, it's because nobody ever thought of it. But the answer, increasingly, we think, is that quite simply, people didn't believe you could balance on two wheels. The only people who knew that were the riders of these bone shakers, of these draisines, hobby horses. I'm going to go back to this one. You see there's two pegs, which you put your feet on to go down a hill. It was the riders of these who realized that you could pick your feet up and you could steer and stay on the bike and go down a hill. And that was the key, we think, when people realized that, to deciding that you could go down a hill and you could pedal and balance. So this is the bone shaker. The correct term is a velocipede. And the difference, as we'll see, is it's got a crank and pedals. So if we go on here, this is a Compagnie Parisienne. It's from 1869 and is a very fine velocipede. It's also a very big one. In fact, it's so big that I've always been scared to ride it. We can see what's happened compared to the draisine. There are now these cranks with pedals on them. You pedaled it. The saddle, instead of being a great big sort of cushiony thing, is just a pan, and it's on a great big long spring. So that spring took out a lot of the bumps in the road and made it okay. Whereas on a draisine or hobby horse, if you wanted to stop, you put your feet on the ground. And in fact, those of us who did the ride from Nancy to Karlsruhe all wore out at least one pair of running shoes going down hills, because you just put your foot down and use them as brakes. And of course, the rubber wore out pretty fast. On these, you've got a brake. The brake is here. You can see there's a pad. And if you look closely, I don't think you can see, there's a piece of string. It goes backwards and forwards and up here and up to the handlebars, because the handlebars rotate. They go round, whoops, let's go back. They go round and round. And as you wind them up, it pulls that string and puts the brake on. And the brake is quite effective. The other thing to see is here, we'll have a closer look in a minute. There's a sort of scoopy metal thing at the front here. And that's for going down a hill. You put your legs, your hock, as they call it, the hock supports. You put your legs up there and you roll down the hill and you control it with the brake. So that is the velocipede. It appears, there's a big debate going on when it was actually invented, and different people claim it, but it looks as though it's either late 1864 or early 1865 in Paris. The reason for the confusion is that 40 years later, after the inventors had died, their sons started claiming who was the true inventor, and it varied. And some were, well, they were fudging the dates and moving it back to be the first, and it confused everybody as to when the machine was actually invented. Well, here we are. This is a comparison. Here's a draisine, and here's actually that same velocipede. The difference, the draisine has two wheels the same size, and not very many spokes. The velocipede, you can see it's a much bigger wheel, but the rear wheel is smaller. In other words, you're getting a differential between the wheels because this is now the driving wheel, which means that as you pedal it, this is the one that makes it go forward. And they soon realized that the bigger this wheel, the longer the circumference, the faster you went. The next thing to note is that this one actually had a brake put on it. You lifted the handle here and that brake applied to the back wheel, but it didn't work very well. The velocipede had a decent brake and it did work. Okay, let's go on. There's the hock rest, the thing you put your legs on going down a hill. And you can see it's nicely curved and flattened. It's quite a comfortable position to go down a hill. There's the pedal. Now notice now that you've got an issue about height. With the Draisine, you can move the seat up and down. With the velocipede, the seat is fixed on that spring. So how do you deal with a person with long legs or short legs? And the answer is the crank either has a slot or this one has got 4 different holes, and you move to make the leg length longer for the pedal. So there's the pedal and the crank. Notice this acorn underneath. Well, what's that all about? Well, if you look at it, you say, oh, well, it's a balance. It makes the pedal face up. So when you're getting on, you put your foot down, you know you're going to hit the pedal. It's not going to be upside down. True. But the acorn has another function. You can't tell it from here, but it actually unscrews. And it's hollow. And you fill it with oil. And there's a little tiny hole going through here to the spindle that the pedal's on. And as you go along, you flick the pedal over once just to put a drop of oil on the spindle before it gets dry and seizes up. So as you're going along, you flick that every mile or two and oil the spindle for your pedal. This is a bit of the original wheel of a velocipede. And although many of them had a metal tire, this one originally had, you can see here, cracked, dried out rubber. And it's got lots of nails holding it on. So they were actually using nailed on rubber tires on some of these velocipedes. There's the brake. This one is on the machine I rode from Paris to Avignon, 865 kilometers. And that took 13 days and there were 8 of us. It was terrific. But it was also 35 degrees down the Loire Valley and very, very hot. This is a wheel made by the Mennonites again. And so it's a new wheel because you don't want to destroy the original wheels of these bikes. The original wheel I just showed you, I just hang up. You can actually just see there it is up there. And notice, like the Mennonite buggies, they've wired in a rubber tire. Well, that's the velocipede, the second age of the bicycle. The third age is called the ordinary bicycle, the high wheel, or the penny farthing. There are different names for it. And you can see one of them up at the top here. A guy is actually just dismounting, I think, from a penny farthing or an ordinary bicycle. Let's have a look at one. This is the one my daughter rides. She may even be listening, I'm not sure. She lives in California. But this is a Columbia. It's made in the United States. The firm was owned by a guy called Albert Pope, who went with some spies to England and snuck around the English penny farthing factories and copied and made notes. And I guess they couldn't take photos in those days with cell phones, but they observed very closely the how and the why, the wherefore of the penny farthing, the ordinary. They came back to the United States and in 1878 started making them, And they picked and copied one called the Duplexi Excelsior, which was not copyrighted in the United States, so they could copy it and get away with it. And you can see what's happened. The front wheel, the driving wheel, it's got bigger, and the back wheel, compared to the velocipede, has got smaller. The pedals are roughly the same, but there is a slotted crank we'll look at in a minute, so you can adjust the length. And here is a step, and the way you get on it and get going is that you put one foot, your left foot, on this step, and you kick the whole thing along. There's the step. You kick it along about 3 times to get it going at 3 or 4 miles an hour. And then you step up and sit in the saddle, find the pedals, and away you go. And they're surprisingly stable at a low speed because of the weight in the tire and the wheel. Because it's solid rubber, it's quite heavy, it becomes stable at a low speed. The brake on this one, because it's slightly later, you can see there's a little brake up here, and there's the brake handle on the handlebars. So this is the ordinary. It's got the name ordinary because it was an ordinary bicycle when they invented the more modern safety bike. The safety bike at that time was regarded as a sort of newcomer to the block. This was the ordinary bicycle. Okay, next picture, and let's compare them. This one we've seen already is the velocipede, company Parisienne from Paris. This is from Coventry in England. It is a Singer Challenge from 1876. The transition from that to that actually happened even quicker. A Frenchman called Mayer in 1870 said, I wonder if I can make that wheel with wire spokes instead of wooden spokes. And he made a wire spoke wheel. They called it the spider wheel because it looked a bit like a spider's web. And he said, okay, now I can make it bigger. And he did. And his guy won the next race because it had the biggest wheel. So 2 weeks later, there's another race. Everybody wanted spider wheels. And very quickly, we switched, evolved, if you like, technically, from that to that, because racers found that this shape, this big wheel, was the fastest wheel. Now, the brake here we've seen is on the wheel. This brake was an early attempt at a brake. It's called a Carter trailing brake. Curiously, it still uses rotated handlebars. You still rotated the handlebars here. And it pulled a piece of string, you can see bits of it coming all the way down here, and it pulled that brake here up, and this side of it dug in the ground. Well, it takes no guessing that he was utterly useless. It dug in a little bit, but it hardly slowed you down. And so very soon they switched to the brake up here I just showed you. This thing, again, disappeared fairly soon, but it's actually a footrest, a bit like the hock rest up here. It's the same idea. Going down a hill, you could put your feet on these footrests and have a brake because the pedals never stop going round. There's no free wheel. The pedals are always going round on both these bikes. Well, there's the footrest looking closer. You can see 2 things sticking out you put your feet on. The danger with these is you didn't want your trousers to catch in the spokes because then they'd catch up and you'd do a spill and do what's called a header. You'll land on your head, which is not recommended. And if you try to prevent that by putting your wrists out, you generally broke your wrists, which is also not recommended. The oilings get more sophisticated too. Instead of flipping the pedal around and a drop of oil going through, you see here the brass one, and here there's a brass oiler onto the axle. And these we'll see close up in a second are the pedals. Very sophisticated pedals with balls of rubber. This was the Singer patented pedal. You could only get this pedal with a Singer bicycle. And you can see here the slotted crank. You could move this down to here. If you've got short legs, you can move it out here if you wanted it at maximum length. And there is this Carter trailing brake. There's a bit of rope pulls it up when you turn the handlebars. There's a spring, flicks it back up, and there's a sort of digging in contraption, utterly useless. And like a lot of inventions, this was a loser. It went within months because so many people had accidents because the brake really didn't work. And there's the springing arrangement, because all these bikes with their hard rubber tires, the ride was quite hard on you. On this spring, this long thing here is a spring and it goes down here. They brought it round forward and back through with a hole to increase the springing effect. It could spring up and down here and take out some of the roughness of the ride, because they were riding on dirt roads. There were rocks, there were things sticking up. They could get stuck in mud, anything could happen. So it was a pretty dangerous sport. Well, it was actually so dangerous that people started asking, how can we make this safer? There were several accidents that killed people in England. England was the sort of center of the penny farthing world. But there were a lot of Americans, and they were having accidents and the odd person getting killed. And the same on the continent. And inventors started playing around with ways to turn this bicycle into something safer. And there were actually a lot of ideas. Many of them came too late, we'll see, and they didn't solve all the problems, as we'll see. So here's the first of the safeties. It was called the kangaroo. And I think the screen thing is hiding the date from, I think it says 1885, does it? And what he's done is, the big wheel is a lot smaller. You can sit on this and your feet are almost on the ground. They're not quite, but they're close to the ground. So you can go sideways and catch yourself. If you flip it, you're not going to go very far. Much safer. The way they achieve this is they've gone to a chain, and you can see there's two chain wheels, a little one and a big one. So this gears this small wheel of 40 inches up to the same size as a penny farthing, let's say 60 inches. Most of these, most of these kangaroos were geared to about 60 inches, which is a big penny farthing. Okay, let's have a look at that gearing arrangement. You see, there's the two gears. There's the smaller chain wheel, the big one, and the chain, a heavy old chain. So this bike is actually a very heavy bike. It's heavier than a penny farthing. Some of the lightest penny farthings are even under 30 pounds. There were racing ones where the saddle goes right on the backbone, and they're about 30 pounds. This is more like 45 pounds. So that is the kangaroo, is the first attempt. It came a bit late because, we'll see in a moment, another invention came along that was a lot better. The next attempt at something safer was the geared facile. This is a very rare bike. I think there are about 13 of them survived. So you can see it looks like a penny farthing, but this wheel is in fact a lot smaller. So it's a bit like the kangaroo. The rear wheel is actually a bit bigger for some reason. These are not pedals. If you look closely, they're pivoted here, they're levers. And as one goes up, the other goes down. So you just go up, down, up, down, up, down, up, down as you ride it. And the trick to it all, we'll look at closely, is here in the middle. So let's go into that middle bit. And you can see there's a gear. This is called a sun and planet gear. It's got a fancier name, but this is the sun, and you can see it's a big wheel. It transfers the pedal power. Here's the pedal with a lever, whoops, to the planet, which transfers it to the sun. It's also known as an epicyclic gear, if you want the technical name. Now, the other thing here is a demi-lune. This curved contraption is simply a trouser guard to stop your socks wouldn't, but if you're wearing trousers of any kind, if that trouser went into that joining of the two gears and jammed it, you would go over on your head. So it was very important to prevent your clothing sticking in the gears. Okay, so that is the geared facile, and the date, the screen thing is hiding the date from me. What does it say? 1890 or 1889 or something? Anyhow, let's go on to the next one. The American Star. And this is, you'd say, oh, it's a penny farthing. Oh, no, it isn't, because the little wheel is now at the front. Where's this pointing on there? Here's the little wheel at the front. So the big wheel is now at the back. So we can't do a header because the little wheel prevents you from going over the handlebars. To work it, it's got a long steering column that bends here. And like the geared facile, this is not a pedal. This, again, is a lever. And we'll see in a minute, it unwinds a strap that pulls the wheel, the big wheel, forward. These came out in, I think that says 1890. They actually came out too late. A lot of these attempts to make the high wheel bike safer came just as the safety bike was coming in. So they sort of came too late. The other thing about this bike, although you couldn't do a header, if you weren't careful or hit a big bump, the front wheel could lift up and you could smack your back of your head as you went backwards onto the ground. And the way you avoided that was simply to put your feet down as you went down to catch yourself. You might end up sitting on it down, but you wouldn't hurt yourself badly. So here is the center of it. There's the long levers. And here is the leather strap that goes round and round 3 times. And it's attached to this drum, in the center of which is a phosphor bronze spring. And the spring, as you push the lever down to about here, the spring winds up. And then when you lift your foot, the thing goes whoosh, back up, and you do it again. The 2 levers are independent. They're not like the geared facile where they got to move in the opposite to each other. These are independent. So these actually were raced. And the guys at the start of a race would push both levers down at once and go off very fast. And then they'd switch to alternating and they'd race them against penny farthings, ordinaries, high wheelers. So these were fairly popular in the States, but they never made it to Europe or England. They were very much a North American bicycle. Well, the most anomalous of all these were the crypto bicycles. They were made by the same guy who made the geared facile. And in fact, the mechanism is really almost the same. You can see there's a kind of great big hub here. On this one, it's on the back side. You can't see it very well. This was, again, a sun and planet gear, excepting there were 4 planets and the sun in the middle. And as you went the pedal round, the wheel, 1 revolution of the pedal made the wheel go round 3 times. Now, this was a very anomalous bike. As you can see, if you look closely, we're into the pneumatic era, right? There's the valves, there's a valve here, and blow up pneumatic tires. They came 1896 and 1897, which was really 10 years after the very first safety bike had appeared. But Boothroyd, who was the inventor, insisted that older people did not want to ride the newfangled bike. They wanted to ride this kind of bike. And notice the strange thing, they're called front drivers. You still pedaling like an ordinary, a penny farthing, like a velocipede, you're still pedaling the front wheel. And the rear wheel is simply a balancing thing. So this anomalous bike was moderately popular. The ladies rode the smaller Bantam, which is this one here. There it is. The ladies rode that one. The gentleman's was a bit stronger. You see, it's got 2 top tubes to stiffen it up, make it a bit stronger. These were, as I say, moderately successful in England amongst the older generation. And most of the surviving pictures are people in their 40s, 50s, and even 60s riding these machines. Well, the hard tire safety is the 5th stage. And notice the date. It appeared in 1886. And this bike up here, it's not a very good picture because I don't have one. There's only about 2 or 3 of these survived. This was called the Rover, and it had indirect steering. You see the handlebars and then funny levers here steering the front wheel. For 2 or 3 years, the inventor, Starley, J.K. Starley, kept changing it, improving it, and so on. There was learning. He got feedback from riders saying, this bike's impossible, it's crap, can't you come up with something better? And within a few years, the Rover, which was what it started out up here, ended up looking fairly like a modern bicycle. And they were still using big names. Lord Barry rides the Rover. If Lord Barry rode a Rover, then everybody had to ride a Rover. So this is the hard tire safety. There's one of them, the earliest one I've got. I think it's 1888, is that right? And you can see it's a cross frame. The frame of the bike makes an X. Well, they produced these quite early on, and very soon they collapsed because the stress on this X was impossible. There's the weight of the rider, he hits a bump, the front wheel comes up, and this thing just bent to heck. And very soon they realized, feedback again, they had to put in a support here, that's a stiff wire, and another one underneath to stop the stresses on this X. This is a Premier made by a firm called Hillman, Herbert, and Cooper. Those of you who have been around long enough may remember the name Hillman Cars. Hillman went on to make cars, but like many of the bicycle makers, they began on bikes and then switched to motorbikes around about 1900, and soon thereafter were starting to make cars. Some of them were successful and some were not. Notice the date. Dunlop has actually invented his pneumatic tire, but nobody is using them. This is still a hard tire. Notice footrests. Because it's a fixed wheel, the pedals never stop going round. Either you pedal and pedal the whole of your ride until your legs are worn out, or if you can, you put your feet up on these pegs and take a break. They're quite hard to get on, although you can't see it. On this side here, there is a peg by the back wheel. You can see it on this one right here, same idea. There's a peg by the back wheel and you got on it rather like a penny farthing. You kicked along, got into the saddle and found the pedals. The other thing this bike shows you, curious thing, this is a lamp. It's a candle lamp. And it, at night you'd say, well, you want a light to light the road. And the ads did say that they lit the road. But the truth of the matter is that these lights were pathetic. They would barely light the road a foot in front of you. I think the main purpose of these early lights was to warn other road users, particularly, well, it meant horses, of course, and pedestrians, that there was cyclists coming. So they would see the light bobbing along the road, bouncing along on the dirt, and they would see that there's a bicycle coming, because bicycles don't make a lot of noise. And they'd know to move their horse to one side of the road or whatever. Well, that's 1888, I think. And 4 years later, even 3 years later, bicycles started looking like this. And you might look at this and say, well, that's pretty modern. That's a diamond frame bicycle. And in fact, the diamond frame was accepted. They got it eventually right. And for the next 100 years or more, there's even still, all your Dutch bikes are basically diamond frame bikes. It's only the latest MTBs and trail bikes and 29ers and so on that have gone away from this. So there's your diamond frame. There's your coaster pegs on the front fork, hard tire. By the way, this cross frame, just to go back to it, this is you may not realize it, this is a racing bike. Got very narrow 3/4 inch tires. It's got wide handlebars, so you've got a lot of stability, and it's the most beautiful bike I've got. I love riding it. It's a beautiful bike. It looks clunky and terrible, but its balance is perfect, and it's only got one gear, of course, fixed, but it rides beautifully. This is not such a nice ride. The saddles now are being springy things. They've got mud guards being put on, and I think, yeah, there's a brake for the front plunger brake. It just, the same as the cross frame, the brake just pushes down on that front tire. And the other thing is there's no lamp on it, but there is room for a lamp. By this time, it was mandatory to have a lamp on your bicycle at night, and you would be stopped if you didn't. The penny farthings rode at night, but they didn't necessarily have lamps. Some of them did, they're called hub lamps. But they also did rides at full moon, because the full moon would light up the road. They could see bumps and rocks and dangerous things to watch. So it was quite normal to go riding a club ride at full moon. Well, the 6th age, we're getting there. This is the pneumatic safety. Now we've got Dunlop's tires that it took about 5 years to get them reliable. They didn't leak air, the valves didn't fall off, they didn't get a puncture every 100 yards. By 1891, the data suggests that if you looked at tires on all the bikes of that year, 1/3 of them were still hard tire, 1/3 were now pneumatic, and 1/3 were what they called cushion tire, which were kind of spongy rubber. And they actually created a lot of road friction, and they weren't nice, and they came and went fairly quickly. So this is the 6th age, the pneumatic tire, but still with a fixed wheel. Well, here's an anomalous bike. The date is blocked out. When I made these slides, the writing was at the side, but for some reason it's gone to the top. I can't see it, but, oh, there we are. It's an 1893 bike. So it's a misfit. It's pneumatic. You can see there's valves sticking out, but that's a wooden wheel and wooden spokes. And Elliot, for some reason, decided that hickory was the right way to make a wheel. So when every other bike, diamond frame and everything else, was into pneumatic metal rims, he is still on pneumatic wooden rims, a curious bike. And he had this funny idea for the saddle spring that if it went round like that, it would absorb some of the shock. That was totally redundant because once you've got pneumatic tires, they absorbed most of the shock. And here's the plunger brake going onto the front wheel. This is 1899. It's a lady's bike, obviously, a drop frame, so a lady with her skirts could get on. It's a Columbia, so that the first penny farthing I showed you was a Columbia. Pope was still making bicycles. What he's done here is he's got a wooden rim, a pneumatic tire. The important thing is he's got rid of the chain. This was called a chainless or a shaft drive bicycle. And it was done because it prevented ladies' skirts getting caught up in chains, and you didn't need chain guards and wheel guards to stop skirts getting caught up. If we look closely, this is inside this is a shaft, and this is called a bevel gear. It's at 45 degrees, and it transfers the energy from the pedals through a bevel gear here to a bevel gear here, and the wheel goes round. And they chatter a little bit. They were quite popular amongst the ladies because it solved the skirt problem, because people were still wearing pretty long skirts at this state. Now, this is another curious bike. This is a track bike. It probably dates the original parts of it to the 1920s or 30s. It's not clear because It's been put together by bits and pieces of different bikes. But it tells us a little bit about track racing and some of the bikes of that period. The bicycle frame, the dark blue, is a CCM flyer. The chain wheel is off a race cycle. It's a huge chain wheel. It originally had a small sprocket on the rear. You'll notice it's got no brakes, no mud guards, no gears, no anything. When you race on the track, all you're allowed to have is two wheels, the frame, the pedals and chain arrangement, and the saddle. That's it. The only way you can stop it is by pushing against the pedals. Now, on the track, you can wind these bikes up to 40 miles an hour. They go pretty fast. Getting them started is the headache. When I first had this with the small chain wheel, I couldn't start it. The gear was so high, I would dislocate my knees before I could get it going. And the way that you started these bikes was you had a handler who stood behind you, you got on it, you put your toes in, you see these old-fashioned pedal clips, you put your toes in the clips, and when the starter said start, the guy, your handler, ran with you and pushed you to get you up to a point where you could actually turn these things without damaging your knees. Some of the races you would be started and it'd be a flying start. So you'd go around the track. It would take 2 laps of the track to get this bike up to full speed. And then you'd have to hit the starting line together, all lined up. And off you go and you'd do 4 laps of the track or whatever the race was. And when you'd finished, you'd then have to do another lap or 2 just to slow it down to a sensible speed. The tracks were banked, of course, because otherwise you just shoot straight off and disappear into the nearest field. Okay, the last period. This is the pneumatic tire with a free wheel. Free wheels had actually been around for a long time, and they were used on machinery. They were called a pawl. And that sort of funny penny farthing with a little wheel at the front had a free wheel, a pawl in the wheel. But it didn't really catch on till 1894 when Linley and Biggs got people to accept that it was nice to take a break and freewheel along going down a hill without having to pedal and without having to put your feet up and have a rest. So this is the last stage. Well, this is a Dursley Pedersen bike. A Danish man, Mr. Pederson, invented it. You can see it. It's in probably spindly, thin little sticks holding it together. 2 more here, 2 more there, a couple here. The strength came from the way they were held together. There, and they're united there, and there, and there. And see these 2 wires at the back? Without those, this, when you sat on the saddle, this would break. There's the saddle. It's a hammock. It's not a normal saddle. When you ride this bike, it's like riding a snake. It's sort of swinging all over the place. The spring, you're going sprawling, sprawling. And you're swinging around everywhere. Anyhow, this is the Dursley Pedersen. It was fairly successful, and it was made from the late 1890s through to about 1918, 1920 were the last ones that I know of. There was a ladies' version too, which looked even more peculiar. And they had gears. Not only did they have a free wheel, they had a gearbox. There had been gears on earlier bikes, but now they were becoming standard. And this was the Patterson Gear. There's a close-up of it. You can see it's got various things and a clutch. The Patterson Gear had one problem. The clutch didn't work very well. And there was a rival gear made by 2 guys, Sturmey and Archer. And the Sturmey Archer gear worked better. And Pederson never solved his clutch problem very well. And so the Sturmey Archer gear became the norm. And this was, in effect, a failed technology. It didn't spread. There's the Dursley Pedersen. Nice bike to ride if you're not in a hurry, because I say it does sort of, is a bit like a snake. I think this is the French bike, a Huron Retro Direct. Now you look at it and you say, well, it's like a fairly normal bike. It's got a brake on the front wheel, but there's a brake here. But if you look, there's something very strange going on at the back here. And if we go and look at that, this is what it is. There are, in fact, two rear sprockets, the big one and the little one. The little one is the high gear, and this is the low gear. So how did it work? Well, the answer is both of these sprockets had a free wheel, but they went in the opposite directions. So when you're riding along in the flat with the wind behind you, you want to be in high gear, then you're pedaling along here, and this is driving the bicycle forwards, this small sprocket. And you're going along until you come to the Beaujolais, there's a big hill, and you haven't had a glass of wine, and you need some energy, and you can't get up the hill. So what do? You start pedaling backwards. It's a very strange feeling, but when you pedal backwards, the driving wheel becomes this big one. It's a lower gear. And so it goes around, the chain goes around that way, and then this is freewheel. See, this is now freewheel. And when you're going the other way, that's the freewheel. So this was a clever French invention. It relied upon the chain being misaligned slightly. You had to go both ways around the axle. And it worked. And these sold fairly well through, I think they appeared after the First World War, and they were popular through to the Second World War. So they had quite a long lifespan as a fairly popular French bike, and they do turn up from time to time. They're still around. And I think the last bike I'm going to show you is this Triumph Muller, another Danish invention. Mr. Muller invented it, but he didn't have the resources to make it, and he persuaded Triumph, the car company in England, to make them for him. It was the 1930s. Triumph were looking for make-work projects because nobody was buying cars, and they thought maybe people will buy this bicycle. So they started making them. Well, as you can see, it's a little different. Firstly, it hasn't got handlebars. It's got this funny steering wheel up front here, and the brake is actually on the steering wheel. There's a Bowden cable taking it down to the front wheel. To do that, he's got here, we'll see in a minute close up, a universal joint, because he's got to transfer the steering energy through, I don't know, 45 degrees or something like that, down to the front forks. The other curious thing you'll see is the angle of it all. It's low. It's actually called a semi-recumbent. So this was one of the first bikes to move towards what's now become, of course, a total recumbent, where you're almost lying on the ground. This is a semi-recumbent, but you're recumbent enough that the seat doesn't work without this back to it. Otherwise, you'd slide off the seat and sit on the back mudguard. It didn't work. It was a lemon. They sold a few, there's not many around. They're almost unrideable. Every time I've ridden it, I've ended up in a bush on the side of the road. They wiggle, they're twitchy, you have to really persevere to be able to ride this bike. There is the steering arrangement, which is the most curious thing on this bike. You see, there's the universal joint. It's going down to the front forks. There's a sleeve holding the steering going up to the steering wheel. And these are some springs that brings the steering back to straight forward. In other words, it tends to be self-straightening. If you don't pay attention, you don't have to worry, it straightens itself out. Well, that brings us to the Second World War, and that's where I'm going to stop, because there've been a lot of bikes developed really from the late 60s through the 70s, 80s, 90s, and now today. All sorts of new materials, gears, electronics, you name it. And I'm not going to get into that because I think I've gone on quite long enough. So thank you for listening. Thank you for your interest. and remember to share the road.
Thank you so much, Glenn. Did anybody have any questions? Nothing came through the chat, but you're welcome to unmute your mics and ask any questions you have. And I was just wondering, Glenn, with the collection that you have, what's your favorite piece in your collection of bikes?
Oh, that's a hard one. It's actually a tricycle. And I didn't show you tricycles, but as the bike evolved, so the tricycle evolved. And it actually came first because, as I explained to you, people didn't think you could balance on two wheels. Mm-hmm. First tricycles we know were in the 1600s. They were invented in Germany. And it was invented by a disabled. In fact, the work I've been doing recently is on cycling for people with disability. Wow. And there's a lot of potential now for disabled people to go out for a ride or go out for a ride with somebody else, but to enjoy cycling. But it began, basically, the tricycle began actually as an invention, a hand bike, if you like. It was driven by the hands by a paraplegic. Oh, wow. My favorite bike is a tricycle.
And we had a question come in the chat from Trudy who said, are you and Ron Miller still riding your English Ordinary?
You'll have to ask Ron whether he is, but I know Trudy, and the answer is yes. I ride a little bit on my Ordinary, and my favorite ride I hope to do in the next week or two is to go to a place called Ripley. It's a village 10 miles from here for my morning coffee. So it's a 20-mile ride by the time I get back.
Did anybody else have any questions they'd like to ask? No. Trudy said in the chat, nice, please take a selfie and send.
Okay, I will take a selfie. Well, actually, it won't be a selfie. It'll be Mary and me on my favorite tricycle.
There you go.
I've been restoring it for 4 years, off and on, when I find time. It's a tandem, so there's two people sit on it, the lady at the front and the guy at the back, who's the backseat driver. It's got 3 wheels, of course, being a tricycle, but it doesn't look like a modern tricycle. There's a big wheel on one side and 2 little wheels on the other side. Very strange machine.
Oh, wow. So it looks like we're kind of a quiet group today.
I was going to ask Glenn, I know Kincardine quite well, but I don't know where your museum is.
Well, I can help you, because I'm sure you know where the beer store is.
I certainly do.
It's straight across the road from the beer store.
Oh, okay.
It's there's a house at the back of the garden, and there's a back street. There's a shed, a grey modern shed that I built about 4 years ago, and that is the Bicycle Museum.
Oh, thank you. I spent 2 weeks there every summer for about 30 years.
It's not open all the time because I've got a million other things I'm doing, but I ask people to phone me or send me an email and say they want to be there at a certain time, and if it works, I will be there and give them a tour. And if there's a group, well, now that COVID's over, I can take bigger groups around. It's a sad story, really. The museum opened, we had a big opening party 2 years ago, just as COVID came. And I'd set it up. It's particularly designed for school kids, teach them a bit about transportation and technology. And there's this, well, you probably know it, KDSS, the secondary school in Kincardine, is 100 yards away. And I've not had a school group round because of the COVID. So for 2 years, I've had little groups, and I've had people from community living and so on. But the school groups I'd like to take round haven't been able to come because of the lockdown. So John, next time we're in Kincardine, send me an email, or because of the website, you'll find the website, or phone me, I'm in the phone book, and you'll have a tour.
Any other questions or comments?
Is the museum, Glenn, open any day of the week? This is Trudy.
No, it's not open any standard hours. It's a mile from my house, so for special events like Kincardine, if you know, Kincardine has a Scottish festival.
Yes.
So it will be open for the Scottish festival for several hours each day. It's a 2 or 3 day festival. Okay. And for Canada Day and for the Family Day in August, so on, it'll be open for certain hours. But I'm involved in a whole bunch of community things, and I'm heavily involved in a book on cycling at the moment.
Again?
Yes. It's a major project. It's called The Companion to Cycling. There are 50 chapters, 10 short chapters, 90 authors scattered around the world. And we're probably a month away from getting the manuscript complete. And I'm the lead editor, so I'm the unpopular guy with the whip saying, where is that chapter of your revised, do this, do that. But it will be ready soon. And then I will have a lot more time to enjoy myself.
Well, I may be up in that neck of the woods in August. I should give you a call.
Do.
Any more comments or questions? No, well, in that case, a very big thank you again to Glenn for taking the time to prepare this presentation for us. It was a really interesting and unique opportunity to see an aspect of history that I don't think many of us know about, especially through the eyes of our modest bicycles. To those in our audience, thank you once again for your support of the North Atlantic Historical Society. We're constantly aiming to improve our programming and would therefore appreciate it if you would complete a brief survey on today's event, a link for which I've posted in the chat box and which will be sent to you by email as well. We're also happy to announce that our next speaker event will be taking place on August 2nd at 7 p.m. with local metal detectorist Ward Hewitt, who will be talking about metal detecting in Lanark County and who is excited to show off some of his most interesting finds. So for more information, you can send me an email and more information will be coming. So keep an eye on your inboxes, and you can register now by emailing me at nlrmuseum@gmail.com. So we hope that you enjoyed today's event and we look forward to seeing you again soon. And thank you once again, Glenn.
Good night, and thank you.